You are standing in a Formula One pit lane. A crew of 20 people is about to change 4 wheels on a car in under 2 seconds. Each wheel is a carbon fiber and magnesium alloy assembly engineered to survive lateral forces 5 times the pull of gravity, while a car corners at 150 miles an hour. It is, by any measure, one of the most precise rotating objects a human being has ever built, and it exists because, roughly 5,300 years ago, in a marsh south of what is now Ljubljana, someone cut 3 planks of ash wood, shaped them into a disc, drilled a square hole through the center, and jammed an oak axle through it. That is not a metaphor. That wheel, waterlogged, sealed in peat for 5 millennia, pulled out of the mud in 2002, is a direct structural ancestor of the wheel on that F1 car. Same basic machine, same problem being solved. The materials changed, the physics did not. So how did we actually get from a rolling log to a rotating disc mounted on an axle? The story is older, stranger, and far less linear than the neat caveman invents the wheel version most people carry around in their heads. For roughly 2.5 million years, every human being who ever moved something heavy did it the same way. They dragged it, or they carried it. That's not a failure of imagination, it's a failure of the material available. Wood splits along its grain, stone shatters, and a load-bearing rotating disc, round enough to roll true, strong enough at the hub not to crack under weight, mounted on an axle precise enough not to shake itself apart, is a genuinely hard object to make with nothing but stone tools and hand labor. This is why the wheel shows up so much later in the archaeological record than fire, or the spear, or woven rope. It isn't a simple idea, it's a manufacturing problem. The dragging itself was punishing. Pulling a loaded sledge across dry ground means fighting friction across the sledge's entire contact surface. All the time, the whole distance. Every early society that moved heavy stone, including, most likely, the builders who raised the megaliths of Stonehenge, is believed to have discovered a partial workaround long before anyone built an actual wheel, laying loose, unattached wooden rollers under a sledge and walking the load forward over them, continuously carrying the rearmost roller up to the front. It's crude, it's labor-intensive, and it works because it converts a sliding problem into a rolling one without needing a single fixed axle. This is very likely the conceptual bridge between dragging things and the wheel. Someone, somewhere, watching a round log outperform a flat sledge, and understanding in a purely observational way that roundness beats friction. Here is the part almost nobody expects. The wheel wasn't invented for transportation. It was invented for pottery. Long before anyone put a wheel under a cart, potters in Mesopotamia were using small rotating turntables, archaeologists call them tournettes, to shape clay. The earliest of these, simple stone or clay discs pegged to the ground and spun by hand, date to roughly 4200 to 4000 BCE. They were slow, effortful, and needed constant re-spinning, but they proved something crucial. A disc, mounted on a central pivot, could rotate freely and predictably. That is the entire mechanical concept of the wheel, already mastered, in miniature, in a potter's workshop, centuries before it appears under a vehicle. A stone potter's wheel recovered from in what is now southern Iraq, has been dated to around 329 BCE. And within a few centuries of the tournettes spread through Mesopotamia, the same basic mechanism, a disc, a pivot, rotation, shows up scaled up, reinforced, and turned sideways under a cart. Nobody invented that leap in a single afternoon. Someone looked at a spinning potter's disc, looked at a sledge sitting nearby, and made a connection that had never been made before. What came out of that connection was almost certainly crude, a thick, heavy disc, cut straight across a tree trunk, mounted on a fixed axle, so that wheel and axle rotated together as one unit. It would have wobbled, it would have split along weak grain lines under load, but it would have worked well enough to prove the concept, and that was enough to set off centuries of refinement by anonymous craftspeople with no blueprint except the failures of the wheel before theirs. The earliest solid disc wheels had one glaring engineering flaw. A single cross-section of a tree trunk has wood grain running in every direction relative to the wheel's circumference, which means some parts of the wheel are structurally strong and others are dangerously weak, especially right at the hub, where the axle hole was drilled and stress concentrated hardest. Wheelwrights solved this with a construction method, now called the tripartite, or three-plank, wheel. 3 separate wooden planks doweled and cross-braced together into a single disc, cut so the strongest grain ran around the wheel's circumference, instead of fighting against it. The Ljubljana Marshes wheel, radiocarbon dated to between roughly 30,000 FLARV, 50 and 3100 BCE, by the Vera Accelerator Laboratory in Vienna, and discovered by a team led by archaeologist Anton Velishchek, is built exactly this way. Ash planks for the wheel, a matching oak axle, 120 centimeters long, the wheel and axle still fitted together after 5,000 years underwater. It's not a first attempt. The joinery is too precise, too practiced for that. Whoever built it had almost certainly built wheels before. The axle itself needed its own generation of trial and error. On the Ljubljana wheel, the axle hole is square, meaning the wheel and axle were fixed together and rotated as a single unit. Functional, but a problem the moment you need to turn a corner, since a rigid axle forces both wheels to travel the same arc, regardless of which way the cart is turning. Later wheelwrights, working independently in different regions, solved this by letting the wheel spin freely around a fixed axle instead. A small mechanical change with enormous consequences for maneuverability. We don't have to guess at any of this from the wheels alone. The physical record and the pictorial record actually disagree about who got there first, and that disagreement is itself part of the story. The Bronocice pot, a ceramic vessel of the funnel beaker culture, excavated in southern Poland in the 1970s, is incised with an image of a 4-wheeled wagon with a draft animal shaft and has been radiocarbon dated to roughly 3500 to 3350 BCE, making it the earliest well-dated depiction of a wheeled vehicle anywhere in the world, even though the actual wooden wheels it shows rotted away millennia ago. At almost exactly the same time, clay tablet pictographs from the Iana district of Uruk in Mesopotamia depict wheeled sledges and wagons, dated to a similarly narrow window in the late 4th millennium BCE. Wheeled vehicle evidence also appears within decades of the same window in the Makeup culture of the northern Caucasus. 3 regions, thousands of kilometers apart, converging on the same mechanical solution within roughly a century or two of each other, with no clear evidence any one of them taught it to the others. Archaeologists still argue about whether that means the idea spread unusually fast along trade networks, or whether it was invented more than once, independently, by people solving the same friction problem, with the same available materials. If there's a single innovation that turned the wheel from a useful cart component into a weapon of war, it's the spoke. A solid wooden disc wheel is heavy, and weight is the enemy of speed. The spoked wheel solves this by removing almost all the wood from the middle of the wheel, replacing a solid mass with a rim, a hub, and a small number of thin wooden struts connecting them. Struts that work in tension rather than compression, meaning far less material can carry the same load. The earliest confirmed spoked wheels come from Sintashta culture burial sites in the southern Ural region of modern Russia, where archaeologists have found something almost eerie. The wheels themselves rotted away completely, but their impressions survived, stained into the burial pit soil, spokes and all. Radiocarbon dating on multiple Sintashta chariot burials places the earliest of them before 2000 BCE, pushing the origin of the spoked wheel and the light, horse-drawn chariot earlier than the previously assumed Near Eastern timeline, and touching off an ongoing scholarly argument about whether the Sintashta finds represent true chariots or simply light 2-wheeled carts. Whichever term is correct, the mechanical leap is the same. Someone figured out that a wheel doesn't need to be solid to be strong. It just needs its wood positioned correctly to resist the forces actually acting on it. The spoked wheel spread with the chariot itself, and fast. Within a few centuries it reaches Anatolia, shows up on cylinder seals from Kultep, dated to around 1900 BCE, and eventually becomes the signature weapon platform of Bronze Age warfare across the Near East, a machine whose entire tactical advantage rested on the fact that its wheels weighed a fraction of what a solid disc would. The wheel didn't stabilize into one universal design once it existed. It diversified, hard, based on what each culture actually had to work with. In forested regions with abundant hardwood, solid disc and tripartite plank wheels persisted for centuries after the spoked wheel had already proven itself elsewhere, simply because timber was cheap and the extra weight didn't matter for slow-moving agricultural carts. In steppe and desert regions, where speed and lighter loads mattered more, spoked designs spread faster. And in one part of the world, the wheel diversified into something almost nobody expects: a toy. Beginning in the 1940s, archaeologists working in and around Veracruz, Mexico, uncovered small ceramic figurines, dogs, jaguars, armadillos, monkeys, with holes drilled through their legs and wheels mounted on axles in place of feet. More than 100 examples have since been found across Mesoamerica, some dating to the Toltec period, roughly 900 to 1100 CE. The mechanical principle, a rotating disc reducing friction, was understood here completely independently of anything happening in Eurasia, and yet full-scale wheeled transport never developed. The most widely accepted explanation is straightforward. Mesoamerica had no domesticated animal large enough to pull a heavy wheeled cart, and without a draft animal, a wagon is just a box that still has to be dragged by a person, at which point human porters carrying loads on their backs were simply more practical across the region's mountainous terrain. The wheel, invented twice, on two sides of the planet, tells you something important. An idea being correct isn't enough to make it spread. It has to meet the right animals, the right terrain, and the right need at the same time. It's worth pausing on something easy to miss in all of this. The people cutting three-plank wheels in a Slovenian marsh or staining spoke impressions into Russian burial soil were not less intelligent than the engineers who design a Formula One wheel assembly today. They were exactly as intelligent. What they lacked wasn't cognitive capacity, it was accumulated knowledge, the kind that has to be observed, remembered, and physically passed from one pair of hands to the next, because writing for most of this story didn't exist yet. Every generation of wheelwrights inherited the failures of the generation before them. This axle hole splits, this grain orientation holds, this joint needs cross-bracing. Nobody invented the wheel. Hundreds of anonymous people, over roughly 2,000 years, each corrected one small thing about the wheel that came before theirs. Which brings us back to that pit lane, and those 20 crew members changing 4 wheels in under 2 seconds. Trace the lineage backward, and it never actually breaks. Carbon fiber F1 rims descend from steel-spoked bicycle and automobile wheels, which descend from wooden-spoked chariot wheels at Sintashta, which descend from the 3-plank tripartite wheel pulled out of a Slovenian marsh, which descends from a potter's spinning clay disc in Mesopotamia, which descends from a length of rolling log that someone once simply watched outperform a dragged sledge and understood, correctly, that round beats flat. Every wheel currently turning on Earth is still obeying the exact same physical principle a Neolithic craftsperson worked out by hand, through failure, without a word for friction, and without ever knowing what a wagon in Poland or a chariot on the Russian steppe looked like. We didn't invent the wheel once. We're still inventing it, every time someone makes it a little lighter, a little truer, a little faster than the version that came before. If you want more stories like this, real inventions, real evidence, no myths, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming.